He said, I was walking through an alley one day, and I came across a bottle, and it was all dirty, and I wiped it off, and I saw these fancy decorations, pulled the cork out, and out came the smoke. And there was a genie, and the genie said, you have released me from my prison of the ages, and now I will grant you 2 wishes. Well, 2 this time is not as good as 3, but anyway, 2 is pretty good. And so the fellow says, I get 2 wishes, no matter what I want. The genie says, yes, your wish is my command. So he said, all right, genie, my first wish is, let's see, I think, yes, I know what it's going to be. I would like to be able to afford, no matter what it is I want in life, I want to be able to have enough money to buy it. Whether it's a drink or a trip around the world or a yacht, no matter what it is, I want to be able to afford it. And he said, the genie went, vroom, I grant you your wish. And he said to the bartender, ever since that day, no matter what I've ordered, no matter how expensive or inexpensive it is, I reach in my pocket, and it's a miracle. I always have the right amount of money. And he said, the other wish I gave to the genie was this. He said, genie, I've always wanted a chick with long eyelashes and long legs who always agreed with everything I wanted to do. I bet you'll never believe it, but those jokes have a connection with what I want to talk about. And the moral to those stories is that you ought to be very, very careful what you wish for, because if you get it, it may not be what you thought it was going to be. And that's my theme tonight. And I'm going to take this presentation as a little condensation of the old original recipe talk on the Federal Reserve, plus a little update at the end. And I've decided to condense a summary of it down into 2 sound bites. You know, when you're traveling around and every once in a while you get a chance to go on the radio, and even more rarely somebody from a television station will say, well, we hear you're going to be in town tonight. Would you like to be on the local news? And you say, yeah, of course. And they say, well, we'll give you about 10 seconds to summarize your 90-minute speech. So you get to be pretty good on condensing things down, you know. So I decided to pretend like I was being given about 10 or 15 seconds to describe each of these 2 parts of my presentation, and I concocted these sound bites. So you better listen carefully to this. Part number 1. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created because Americans made a wish to the government genie to control the banks on behalf of the people. But what they got was a banking cartel that now controls the government. That's statement number 1. Statement number 2. Today, Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. Now, I've just summarized it all, so we can all go home now. That's everything I want to say, and so the rest of the time will be spent primarily just filling in some of the details. So I think a good place to begin is take a look at the book titled The Creature from Jekyll Island. I know this is common ground for many of you, but I hope there are many here that don't know what that's all about. What's The Creature from Jekyll Island all about? And I must admit that I had some fun with that title because it has kind of a mysterious sound to it. It sounds like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or it may sound like the creature from the Black Lagoon. And I thought if anybody saw the book in a window of a bookstore, they might get curious, thinking it was a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that. But all kidding aside, the title really does have a great deal of significance because Jekyll Island is a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia, and it was on that island back in 1910, 3 years before the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, which was 1913. But back in 1910, the Federal Reserve System was created in all of its important features. It was designed and created on Jekyll Island in 1910. And when I began to research this subject, I realized that Jekyll Island in those days was privately owned. It was owned by a small group of billionaires from New York, people like John D. Rockefeller, people like J.P. Morgan, their business associates and their friends. This was a privately owned island. It was a resort island, and it's where their families went to spend the cold winter months. And they had beautiful mansions there. They called them cottages, but you can visit the island today. I hope you will when you're in the area, because those cottages, so-called, are beautiful examples of architecture from that period of history. And they've been most of them anyway, have been restored and maintained by the state of Georgia now. So it's almost like a shrine to these people. But the key structure on the island is the clubhouse, as they called it. In fact, the name of that island and this association which they owned was called the Jekyll Island Club. And they have a beautiful clubhouse, which is now run by the Marriott Hotels. And you can go in there and have a nice lunch. In fact, I was there just a few months ago for a meeting and checked into the hotel and got to stay in one of the rooms. Nice little room. It's quite eloquent for the time. But remember, the really big families had their own mansions on the island. But this is a place where visitors could have come. So you can visit the island today. And if you do that, and you're leaving the clubhouse, and you go out it's kind of the back door, just before you go out the back door, turn to your left, and you'll see another door goes to a side room. And on the door, there's a plaque. And it says, the Federal Reserve Room. And if you go in that room, you see pictures on the wall of the men, the 7 men, who actually created the Federal Reserve System in that room, in that building, back in 1910. And I found that very curious to discover that the Federal Reserve System, which I was given the impression when I was in school was a government agency. I thought that should be created in Washington, D.C. I thought it was strange that here it was on a private island created in this room. And then I discovered what was even more amazing is that the conditions of this meeting were secret. A great deal of secrecy prevailed. The men were told to arrive, well, back up a little bit. The story begins in November of 1910 when Senator Nelson Aldrich took his private railroad car, you can imagine, like having your private Boeing jet today, to the New Jersey Railroad Station, and there it was in readiness for the arrival of himself and 6 other men who were instructed to come to the station, train station, separately, not to be seen together that night, not to dine together that night, to avoid newspaper reporters at all costs. See, in those days, the reporters used to hang out at the train station because before the era of aircraft, all the dignitaries, all the political figures, all the superstars had to travel by train in and out of New York, and that's where they went. And so they had their version of the paparazzi hanging out in the train station to get a picture and an interview and a statement from all of these dignitaries. And so they were instructed to avoid newspaper reporters at all costs. One of the men carried a shotgun in a big black case, just in case he had been stopped by a reporter and asked where he was going. He was prepared to say that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And we find out from his biographer, later years, they wrote about this event, and from his children, who also wrote about it, that this man never fired a gun in his life. That was not his shotgun. He had borrowed it from a friend, just so he could carry it and use it as a kind of a deception, in case he had been asked where he's going. So that was amazing. Once on board the train, the men were told to address each other when talking in the privacy of this railroad car, to address each other with first names only, to avoid using their last names. And in the case of 2 of these men, they dropped their first names completely and adopted code names in the privacy of the car. And I thought that was most strange. And then we find in an article that was published in the Saturday Evening Post, written by one of those participants, he explained why that was. He said they were concerned that the servants on board the train would find out who all of these people were together, and that they were spending some time together and going to Jekyll Island